Well, then, welcome everybody. I'm happy to see that more and more people are joining for today's event. I'd like to welcome you to a very special event of today, run by our project Interfaces, which is part of an initiative for sustainable land management in Africa, funded by the German Ministry of Education and Research. We are here together in commemoration of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. That day is officially always on the 25th of November. It was started by the United Nations. And it's a starting day actually of a 16 days activism campaign against gender-based violence taking place in many, many countries all across the world. And globally, gender-based violence is still highly widespread. It is not only taking place in Ghana, of course, it's also happening in other countries across Africa, Latin America, Asia, Northern America, Australia, and Europe. So we have really a global problem in this. And it affects mainly women and girls, but also men and boys. And it's not only a health issue or a family issue, but it's strongly linked to the well-being then also of the individuals, of the families. And research has increasingly also shown how strongly linked it is to economic development and to the introduction. We work a lot in the agricultural sector, so it's also linked to the introduction of more sustainable practices, for example. So it can have effects on a very widespread range that affect people's life. So today we have the honor to have our distinguished speaker, Dr. Constance Avimpoka Akurugu, with us. We are very happy that you take your time, Constance. Dr. Akurugu is our gender expert in the project Interfaces, and she does a lot of research on gender, but also on gender-based violence. And today she will talk about gender-based violence in northern Ghana and the role of traditional leaders in combating it. And we just spent 2 weeks in the field together and also gained very interesting insights. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Constance. I'm very happy to have you here, very happy to have you as the audience here today. And yeah, please welcome with me, Constance, to your talk.
Thank you very much, Tina, for this kind introduction. I also want to appreciate all of you who have made time to come. I will soon start the presentation, and then towards the end, I want to invite us all to discuss and to see how together we can contribute to overcoming the very troubling phenomena of gender-based violence against women and girls. So I'm going to share my screen now and to start. Right, yes. So as Tina already said, this talk is on gender-based violence in northern Ghana and the role that traditional leaders can play in combating gender-based violence across northern Ghana. And this is briefly the outline of our presentation this afternoon. Yeah. So like Tina said, gender-based violence is quite widespread across the globe. It is widespread across sub-Saharan Africa, in Ghana, and especially in northern Ghana. So actually across the world, women, various categories of women and vulnerable groups are exposed to troubling levels of violence in very similar but also different ways. For instance, it is estimated that across Ghana, 1 in 3 women will suffer some form of physical violence exerted by a male partner or a male family member. Yes, so I was just saying that this is an underestimate. If you understand that 2 important factors, one is cultural beliefs and practices that tend to frame gender-based violence as a normal part of social and daily lives, and therefore there is no need for victims to talk about it or to be critical. And also related to this is the way in which gender-based violence is seen as a taboo topic that should not be discussed. So for instance, women and girls are often entreated to show respect to family structures, to show respect to family members by not exposing the perpetrators to public by, for instance, going to the law enforcement agencies to report, like the police, to report incidents of gender-based violence against them. One of the earliest studies on the gender-based violence was conducted by a Guinean woman called Rosemary Ofeabuaji. And in this work, Ofeabuaji looked at how widespread and tolerant gender-based violence against women and girls was in Ghana, and also underscored the fact that it is a phenomenon that people don't talk about. It is seen as an accepted part of social mores of the communities that the victims find themselves in across Ghana. Apart from her study, there have been quite a number of studies, including a groundbreaking one, which was quite extensive in terms of its coverage. This was a nationwide study on gender-based violence by the Human Rights Documentation and Gender Center in Accra. And this nationwide study explored various dimensions and kinds of gender-based violence against women and children. And the report shows how deep-seated gender-based violence, especially spousal ones, is across the Guinean communities, and also how it is normalized by duty bearers, such as the chiefs, the queen mothers. In one instance, for instance, they report to us that a queen mother said that it was okay for a man to beat his wife if he returned home and food wasn't ready, or for the man to beat his wife if she was to wear trousers to bed without performing her conjugal duties and all of that. Other studies include a relatively more recent one, which was carried out by the Institute for Development Studies, the Ghana Statistical Service, and their associates in 2016. In this study, again, they explore the various kinds and dimensions of gender-based violence against women, but also draw attention to the way in which it is accepted amongst both women and men. So for instance, this study shows that 23% of women and over 13% of men thought wife beating was acceptable under some circumstances. So this quite gloomy and troubling discovery of the study led the authors to project that domestic violence in Ghana may persist for a very long time due to the deep-seated sociocultural norms and practices that tend to hold women responsible for violence against them. But this is only one part. The other is the taboo or the prohibitions that society puts on women to not discuss issues of gender-based violence as they are exacted against them. Right, so these studies and many other studies that have been conducted draw our attention to the horrors and the troubling nature of gender-based violence, including fatal consequences such as the violent extermination of women's lives. There have been quite a number of these over the past 2-3 years in Ghana, where partners have been killed because they did not want to continue to stay married or to continue to be in a relationship with a male partner, or where series of, if you like, low-scale abuses culminated into the death of the victims, the victims, right? You also have permanent disfigurement, including pouring of assets on estranged partners, dehumanizing widowhood rights, seclusion, nudity, drinking of concoctions, purification rights, and forced widowhood marriage or inheritance. You see some visuals here. These ones were reported here in the Upper West region. The visuals down there of this woman who was violently attacked by her male partner. Yeah, we also have early or forced marriages, and it is estimated that 1 out of Guinean girls will be married before her 18th birthday. We have wife and partner butter, and many times when people report these kinds of abuses, they are told that, you know, your mother put up with it, your aunties put up with it. So it is just part of being married. And in the same report by the Human Rights Documentation Center, it is said that, you know, if the devil comes over the man and tempts him to slap you, it is not time for you to leave the marriage or to report your husband, for him to expend the resources that he could use for the upkeep of the family on legal matters and things like that. We also have alienation from proceeds of the woman's labor, where women work, toil on the labor-intensive subsistence farming across northern Ghana, and yet they have no say because the produce are believed to be proceeds of the man's labor, and as the man has married the woman and has control over her labor, she doesn't have a say on that, the output from that. We also have violence removal from marital homes without children and belonging. We have lynching of women suspected to be witches. And in 2020, we woke up to the violent lynching of this woman called Aqua Lenta. And then not long ago, just May this year, a couple also were lynched. Aqua's situation happened in the Savannah region, but the lynching of these two people, man and wife, in Sapalsi, in Mion, happened in the northern region of Ghana. So we have all of these. And I also have these statistics from the DOVSU, Domestic Violence and Victims Support Unit of the Ghana Police Service, particularly for the Upper West region, just to show you some figures. And again, we need to recognize or to understand this within the context of the constraints, the cultural constraints I already talked about, which means that many are those victims who don't even go forward to report. But these are the figures for rape, defilement, abduction, indecent assault, attempted child marriage, threats of death, right from 2021 through to 2023. They caution that these are not just the figures for 2023 are not complete because they have not written or compiled their annual reports. So we also have the trends that is broken down by male and female. And when I shared the link on some of the platforms, I was asked why we are focusing on gender-based violence against women and girls. And if you see these figures, I think that it is quite straightforward because you see that most of the victims are men. It is only in 2021 that you see that for the specific case of assault, we have more males than females. Otherwise, for all the rest, you see that there is just a certain pattern. Yeah. So we have very deep-seated sociocultural norms and practices, as well as rituals, which create background conditions that are very conducive for and predispose women and girls to violence across societies in northern Ghana. Yet our country, Ghana, like many others across West Africa and indeed across the world, has acceded to international frameworks for protecting the rights of women, including the CEDAW, that's the Convention for the elimination of discrimination against women, the Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and the Maputo Protocol, which is a protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of women in Africa. And all of these regional and global frameworks have provisions for negotiating women's rights and for ensuring that violence against women is prohibited and accordingly punished, right? So if you look at the Maputo Protocol, for instance, Article 3 is about right to dignity, and Article 3, subsection 4 tells us that the state parties shall adopt and implement appropriate measures to ensure the protection of every woman's right to respect for dignity and protection of women from all forms of violence, particularly sexual and verbal violence. Within Ghana, we have our constitutional provisions, which make provisions for the rights of all persons. So we have Article 12 of our Constitution, which says that all persons are equal before the law. We also have Article 12, which is about the rights and freedoms, and also Article 17, which says that 17.1, which says that all persons are equal before the law. We also have the Criminal Offences Act and its amendments, including the Criminal Offences Amendment Bill, which was passed by our parliament in July, and which is awaiting the president's assent for it to come into force. And in this bill, there are provisions that criminalize accusations of witchcraft, accusing someone for being a witch or practicing witchcraft, and all matters relating to witchcraft, right? So we have all of these. We have the context of widespread gender-based violence against women and girls. We also have both the local and the global instruments and provisions for negotiating women's rights and also prohibiting gender-based violence. But within the context of the dominant presence of customary norms and rules and the way in which these tend to influence social life, it means that these state legal institutions and even the international ones are quite limited in terms of their effectiveness in protecting women, in granting them justice when they have been violated, and all of that. So over a decade ago, a participant of mine trying to explain why there is such dominance of the customary norms and practices in the rural areas, said that, there is diminishing effectiveness of the law right from the city to the village. Similarly, a male traditional leader said that as for these right talks, they are just empty words uttered over the air and therefore cannot be the basis for anything at the community. What works here is what our forefathers have put in place. So you can see how both views expressed by people from worlds apart, if you like, an academy-based research participant, but also a traditional leader, both underscore the fact that there is so much influence of customary laws, customary practices in the rural areas. And our traditional leaders, they are the custodians of these customary laws and norms and practices in the communities. And this is the context within which it is important for us to reflect on the important role that the traditional political system or authority can play in terms of overcoming gender-based violence against women and girls in their communities. So the traditional leaders include the chiefs and their elders, the queen mothers, and also there are the women leaders. We have the religious leaders, the pastors, the church elders, the imams, the malams, the youth associations and organizations. And all of these are important stakeholders. And they are important stakeholders, especially for the first three groups, because they hold so much, or they are held with so much esteem in the communities. So their voices then, or they then have a voice which they can leverage on in order to overcome gender-based violence in the or at the community level. Yeah, so now I turn my attention to what I envisage the role of traditional leaders to be in terms of combating gender-based violence. So the traditional rulers themselves, sadly, are some of our bane or the worst perpetrators of gender-based violence. And sometimes we cannot blame the individual, although we're not just exonerating them from the roles that they play. But sometimes these are so institutionalized, they are so neck deep seated in them that even a very well-meaning traditional ruler might violate the rights of a woman or a girl without even recognizing that this is violation, right? So first of all, I think that there is a need for the traditional leaders to acquire greater awareness of what even constitutes gender-based violence. Tina and I were in Tamale, and we heard one of the traditional leaders say to me that, Madam, are you not asking for too much for women? As for me, in my daily work as a teacher, as a researcher, people ask me whether I'm not asking for too much for women. People tell me that, you know, when you give women their rights, they want to then control you. And there are all these kinds of narratives around. So it is important, first of all, for the traditional leaders, traditional authorities to acquire the know-how and to develop a very critical attitude towards gender-based violence. So once they understand and they themselves become critical of it, you know, they are leaders and they hold so much sway. So the followers will see that the leader himself is aware and he's critical. He doesn't tolerate, or he doesn't himself exact gender-based violence upon the women in his life, his wife, his daughters, sisters, and all the women that he lives with or interacts closely with. That might inspire others. I also think that the traditional authorities need to create awareness in these communities about gender-based violence. Many times when I have been challenged about trying to ask for too much for women, and then I begin to engage men in what gender-based violence is about, or what gender equality is about, and why it is important for us to all take a stance to fight gender-based violence, and they get awareness and understanding. Many will then say, oh, okay, I think I really understand why this is important. So greater awareness creation within the communities, within families, is important for us to just think about what society stands to gain by liberating women and girls from these kinds of normalized violence that I have been talking about. The traditional authorities or leaders can also partner local media houses to advocate or to be advocates on gender-based violence. So the local media, many of them radio stations, community radio stations, and all of that have such a reach that if traditional authorities or traditional leaders can discuss with them and get spaces to go on there, talk about the harm that gender-based violence tends to exact on women and girls, and put themselves up as ambassadors, people will be inspired. And I think that a lot of people may begin to also develop critical attitude towards gender-based violence. Women and girls also need to be empowered to speak up about the kinds of things that they are facing. And in saying this, I also recognize the difficulty that the women and girls face. So yesterday I was at an event as part of the 16 days of activism, right? And this gender desk officer shared with us an example of a woman who was beaten by her husband because she chose to go to the school to teach instead of preparing food to take to the farm for the workers. So this woman went to the gender desk officer to report to her, and when she encouraged her to make a formal complaint, she came back the next day to say she's no longer interested in pursuing this because her husband had asked her to pack her things and leave the house, and she did not want to go anywhere leaving her children. So I acknowledge that there are these kinds of constraints and the way in which sometimes male actors can use women's children as a weapon against them, knowing that across northern Ghana, once a woman leaves the marriage, she cannot take the children with her because the man has paid the bride wealth, and because of that customary, the children belong to the man. They then say, okay, you leave my house. If you have taken me to the police or to court, I can no longer stay with a woman who takes me to the police. Leave my house, knowing very well that the bond and attachment the women have with their children, they'll find it difficult to live, which is only one part of the issue. But also for a rural woman whose source of income is just some petty trading, or who only works on the husband's farm and makes a living together with him out of it, it is quite difficult to live and leave the marital home and go and live somewhere comfortably. And also in some instances, the women are not welcome back home because the brother and the brother's wife might not necessarily want her to come back home and be an additional burden upon them and all of that. So there are all these kinds of challenges and dynamics which also deter the women from even speaking up and coming forward. But I think that with a sustained education and advocacy about the need to speak up, combined with all the other strategies I've discussed here, women might be able to come forward to speak up about their lived experiences of gender-based violence in order to get the support that they need. The traditional leaders also need to make a commitment to fight gender-based violence. So if they commit to fighting gender-based violence by, for instance, declaring zero tolerance in the community for gender-based violence, instituting bylaws and sanctions, and actually ensuring that they implement these. For instance, during my ethnographic fieldwork, a male member of the community who used to abuse his wife, beat her often, was in turn beaten by male members of his family. And after this, he stopped abusing his wife. Okay, so I'm very critical about the kind of violence that was exacted on him. And this is not what I am trying to propose here. What I'm just saying is that if there are bylaws and sanctions for people who abuse or males who abuse their wives and daughters, it might send the information or the message quite clearly to all members of the settlement or community that, look, there is no tolerance for gender-based violence in this community. There is also the COMBAT, which is community-based anti-violence team. And these teams are in some communities, but not all. And what they do is that they are just like groups that support people who are predisposed or who have experienced gender-based violence. And in one study that I reviewed, I learned from that study about how the combat teams in some districts across the northwestern part of Ghana here worked to foil forced early marriage of schoolgirls, how they worked to liberate women from incessant domestic violence and all of that. So it is also my view that if traditional leaders can, in communities that they don't have combat, institute these teams, and then they get support to be able to work, we might be able to achieve the kind of successes that the communities with combat are deriving. Yeah. It is also the role of the traditional authorities to be able to report perpetrators of the law. So obviously all of the bylaws and all the strategies that I envisage or I encourage them to put in place should be for misdemeanors, but for felonies like defilement, rape, murder, or any other serious crime, they should be willing to report the perpetrators to the law enforcement agencies like the Ghana Police Service, so that justice will be served to the victims. Yeah. So in bringing this to an end, a lot of gains have been made over the years, including the passage of the Domestic Violence Act in 2007, DOVSU, for instance, the establishment of DOVSU, which is the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit of the Ghana Police Service. There are also a lot of acts and their amendments. Despite all of these gains, we still have the deep-seated sociocultural norms and beliefs and practices that tend to objectify and oppress women in various ways. And these also ensure that gender-based violence has become quite intransigent for us to overcome. And because of this, we need then to transform the sociocultural norms and beliefs that are receptive of gender-based violence so that we can overcome gender-based violence. We also need to improve women and girls' agency so that they can speak up for themselves. And also we need to be able to deepen women and girls' access to national and local productive resources so that they can be empowered to be able to speak up, but also to stand up for themselves. Thank you very much for your attention.